everyone, my name is Chelsea Troy. I write code for money. I also teach people how to write code at the University of Chicago, also for money. It's not that much money. And then I write a blog, which, contrary to common belief, is not for money. It is at chelseatroy.com. I've been keeping it for a while, and if you scroll back on that blog, all the way back to like the Cretaceous period, you will find a blog post that helped me convince a guy named Austin Vance to give me a job at a place called Pivotal Labs here in Chicago, years and years ago. So, some of y'all I've worked with, for sure. I see some new faces in the crowd. Most of the time when I speak and teach, I stick to purely technical topics, but today I'll be talking about two important professional skills: giving and receiving feedback. Essentially, I'm going to tell you the things I wish someone had told me about feedback in a team setting. So first, let's establish what we mean by feedback. What is feedback? Well, it's a signal. There's a useful bit of information in it, as opposed to noise that doesn't have a tidbit of useful information. It's a signal from external sources. So this isn't our self-assessment, which can be useful, but can also be biased and can have blind spots. This is supplementary signal that we're getting from somewhere else. Sometimes that's our test output. Sometimes that's our system logs. Sometimes it's another person, and that's the kind we're focused on today. It's about past decisions. This isn't about us as people. It's not personal. Sometimes it can sound personal, and it's up to us to tease out of that what decisions we might have made that resulted in the signal we're getting. We'll talk more about this later. And it informs future decisions. Feedback helps us make future decisions. In machine learning, this is how we update weights in our models to make better predictions. In human life, it allows us to gauge the effects of future decisions by remembering what we've learned about the impact of our past decisions. Now, this can go either way. We can get feedback that encourages us to keep doing something, or we can also get feedback that encourages us to change something. So, that's feedback. A signal from external sources about past decisions that informs future decisions. So here's the tricky thing about feedback. The point of feedback is to help a person or an organization improve, and from that perspective we should look forward to it, right? But a lot of times we don't. Instead, feedback ends up producing a lot of anxiety in the workplace. Why is that? Well, a couple of reasons. When we imagine giving feedback or receiving feedback, what we're picturing is usually criticism. That happens because we focus more on negative feedback we receive than positive feedback. It also happens because when we're angry or frustrated with someone, we don't have many options for expressing that in the workplace because it's not considered professional etiquette to ever be angry or frustrated or sad or any of those pesky negative emotions. So we bubble up those negative emotions as feedback because that's the only avenue into which we can shoehorn the airing of grievances in a professional setting. That sets up a picture of feedback as you over on this side of the table and your goal over there, and the person giving feedback on the opposite side of the table as your adversary, blocking the way between you and your goal of getting your perfect score or your raise or your promotion or your bonus money. When we're seeing it like this, it's scary to get feedback because it's scary to hear criticism. And it's scary to give feedback too because we get worried that maybe we'll hurt someone, or maybe we're even worried that the feedback recipient will retaliate against us. Because we have this vision of the feedback giver and the feedback recipient on opposite sides of a table. And conventional advice doesn't shift that perspective. It just sort of tiptoes around it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the conventional feedback advice. I have to check my slides. The slides are on a laptop under me, so. So first of all, constructive. So people will say constructive feedback, or sometimes they'll say opportunity feedback, and the idea is to replace the term negative, but it doesn't change the way anyone thinks about feedback. Instead, everyone back translates this word to negative, and so the technique doesn't work. Okay. Am I allowed to cuss here?
Yes.
The shit sandwich. Thank you. I appreciate the permission. This is where we sandwich a piece of negative feedback in between two pieces of positive feedback. There are some failure modes for this, right? The first one is people know about the sandwich and ignore the positive bread and only focus on the shit in the middle. Or people don't know about the sandwich and they fail to understand the urgency of the feedback in the middle because it seems mostly positive, because there's a good thing on the top and a good thing on the bottom, so that's 2 in 1, right? All right, how about this? Actionable, specific, and kind. This one we've seen, right? This one we've used. This is getting closer to a paradigm for how to deliver feedback. The thing about it, though, is that it assumes that the feedback giver has control over whether their feedback is perceived as kind. And they don't. So why would the feedback giver not have control over whether their feedback is perceived as kind? Well, if the recipient didn't consent to this feedback, its receipt might be unwelcome. And then it might not be perceived as kind. Maybe the recipient doesn't prioritize the skill that this feedback is about, and so the receipt of this feedback feels like a request that they change their priorities. Or maybe the recipient wasn't expecting negative feedback, and the receipt of this feedback was a surprise. This sometimes happens even when people ask for feedback. For example, when someone's asking for feedback, and what they really want is validation. We'll talk about this a little more later. So if all this bad stuff's going to happen to us, why give feedback at all, right? So first, to improve the person's work in your team, and that affects your day-to-day at work, makes your day better, right? Maybe to build a positive working relationship. That's great for your network and your work experience. Maybe to be seen as a mentor and advisor. This is a necessary part of assuming leadership or expertise roles, right? Or, my favorite reason, to get reciprocity for when you ask for feedback. So folks will help you out with feedback when you want to improve. Okay, so we know that we have these benefits to giving feedback. How do we mitigate the risk associated with it? Well, there are a couple of ways we can do this. First, we can wait to be explicitly asked. I wait until I'm explicitly asked for feedback before I give it, typically. That starts to give me a sign that that feedback might be welcome. Second, I determine, does this person want feedback or do they want validation? If they want validation and I tell them that something is wrong, my feedback could be seen as unwelcome or unkind, even if I think they explicitly asked for it. So, the trick here is how, right? How do we determine whether and where somebody wants feedback? Well, first I'll ask for goals. I'll generally ask people for 2 or 3 goals that they have. This helps me understand what are they trying to get better at, and therefore in what areas might my feedback be welcome to them and useful. So what might goals mean? Well, we can talk about it in the context of software, for example. When we're talking about goals in the context of software, the main things we're thinking about depend on the app and the project, but they might include maintainability, the legibility and flexibility of the code that I've written. Maybe I want feedback on that, or maybe I want feedback on documentation, the tests, the names, the literal documentation for the code, or on the resilience of the code to errors and inadvertent bad inputs. Maybe I want feedback on security of the code against deliberate bad inputs. Or maybe I want feedback on the performance of the code, the speed at which it runs, or the speed with which another developer can figure out what's happening. In the context of people, it might be something like, let's say I want feedback on my let's say, the specificity with which I help other people learn something that I know more about, or something to that effect. So when we're talking about those goals, we've got the goals. And next once I have the goals, I want to get the person's self-assessment. And so this is why I want this. If this person's assessment is purely positive, they might be looking for validation, which is sometimes fine, and I can provide it to build a relationship with this person, right? And this isn't necessarily always bad. Suppose somebody wrote some code that they're really proud of, and they come over to me and they're like, hey Chelsea, isn't this really awesome? And I can look at it, and if it is awesome, then I can say, yeah, that's really awesome, right? And that's validation. That's not necessarily a bad thing. In that situation, somebody comes to me, hey, isn't this code awesome? Provided that they're not being facetious, if I look at it and it's not awesome, in my view, like, that might be a situation where what I have to say about this code might not necessarily be welcome or useful or used. So I'm going to think about whether I'm going to say that. Okay? So in that case, I might not be safe to express any reservations in my feedback. All right. So now we've got the goals and we've got the self-assessment. If the self-assessment is not purely positive, if it contains concerns, it is probably safer for me to provide something other than congratulatory comments, right? Because now I know that this person is also sort of taking a critical eye towards this work, and so they would be interested in me doing the same. If I have both those things, then for each goal, I make two lists. First of all, things they are doing that already max out their opportunity to be good at this thing. So this is things they should keep doing the way they are doing to get closer to their goals. Okay? So that's the first thing. Second list. Things where they still have an additional opportunity to improve at the thing they're trying to improve at. So these are things that they can change to get closer to their goals. These are the things that we typically think of as negative feedback, right? But by framing this way, we move the chair in the feedback conversation so that both people are now on the same side of the table, conspiring to help the feedback recipient get closer to their goals. Does that make sense? Okay, so part two. When we're thinking of feedback as this adversarial thing, giving feedback is scary, but receiving feedback is also scary. We're going to come back to the scary part, I promise, but first we need to talk about soliciting feedback. Because we need feedback to get better. To accelerate our careers, we want to absorb the knowledge and perspectives of other people, including their perspectives about us specifically. But in the working world, where peer reviews are not necessarily required, far more often than scary feedback, what we're getting is no feedback or insufficient feedback. And without it, we can't get better as effectively. So how do we incentivize people to give us feedback, even though that might be a scary thing to do in the workplace? Well, a couple things. First, we can expressly solicit it from people rather than just let it roll in. I find that if I gave someone thoughtful feedback in the past, they're more eager to reciprocate when I'm looking for feedback. Even if the only feedback I've given them in the past is validating feedback, they tend to be quicker to give me whatever kind of feedback I'm looking for. So this is a good trick to be aware of if you know someone who's a really good programmer and you'd really like to absorb some of their skill set, but they're not super big on receiving critical feedback themselves. If you provide them with validating feedback, they're still more likely to provide you with critical feedback later, if you want it. Okay. So that's the first one, expressly solicit feedback. Second, we give goals. So this does several things for us. First of all, it makes us safer to give feedback to, because this signals that we want it enough to have thought about what kind of feedback we want. Second, it controls our coworkers' focus. So if we want technical feedback, we won't get personality feedback or something like that. This happens all the time, particularly to people from underrepresented groups in tech, so it's good to head some of that off by controlling the focus of feedback givers towards, say, a technical topic if technical feedback is what we're looking for. It also makes it easier to think of examples because our coworkers can filter their experiences with us to relevant occasions rather than having to think back through 2, 5, 10, 15 years of working with us and figure out what from that should make an appearance in their feedback for us. It also makes it easier for folks to frame their feedback as an attempt to help rather than unwelcome criticism. So this is the second thing we can do. We can provide our goals. Then, we can also follow the steps after we receive the feedback. What are the steps? First, we check that the slide is right. First, we thank them. So this establishes that it's safe to give us feedback, that we probably won't retaliate to them giving us this feedback. And that's important because that's what people are afraid of when they're giving feedback, right? It's this retaliation. So second, we explain how we will act. This is kind of cheating because it means that we get credit for responding to the feedback even before we've done anything to make the changes that the person is suggesting. But I found that this is helpful because it means that they don't have to wait until we've done something to know that we are planning on taking their feedback seriously. Third, we follow through by using the feedback. When we use the feedback and change something, we demonstrate to the giver that we value what they have to say. And finally, we publicly praise the feedback giver for their help. Which doesn't have to be a big thing, doesn't have to be at stand-up or anything. You can just say in front of other people, hey, so-and-so, thanks for giving me that advice on this thing. It really helped me do X, right? So, in this way, that person receives a little bit of a professional reward for helping us, which provides a little bit of an incentive to continue to give us feedback when we ask for it again. But what if it hurts? What if they have something bad to say? So, in a past life, before I was a programmer, I was a coxswain, which is the person who sits in the back of a rowing shell and steers the boat and yells. You don't do any actual physical activity. You just stay as physically small as possible and yell and steer. It's an interesting role. One of the things about the role is that sometimes rowers fill out anonymous evaluation forms about your performance, my performance as a coxswain. This would happen with some regularity, and I absolutely hated it. I felt nervous every single time it happened. A few years in, I started reminding myself, people think what they think about you, so you might as well know what it is. And by not asking them what they think, you're not making them think more highly of you, you're just cutting yourself off from the opportunity to fix it if there's something to be fixed. So if it hurts, there's a couple things I'll do. The aforementioned steps. So first of all, having steps to follow in the event of tough feedback makes the feedback a little easier to receive, because part of what makes that feedback so hard to receive is that there's this panic associated with not knowing what to do or say. And if we have steps to follow, then we now know what we can do or say, and that can reduce some of that panic. Second, a night of sleep has prevented me from making many a rash decision. Sounds like some of you relate. I tend to be able to distance myself and think about things a little more clearly after I've slept on them. Right? Okay, so third, we can do some research. When I get feedback, I look it up. Have others received this feedback? How common or rare is it to receive this feedback? Who tends to get it? Why do they tend to get it? How do they fix it, right? There might be something on Google that can help you understand this is common or this is not common, or these are the people who tend to get it, and these are some things that you can do to make it better. So fourth, I find a processing buddy. So this is another person who's going to help me work through my feedback. I purposely find someone who has more institutional power than me. So somebody maybe with more power than me in the company, or somebody with more experience or something like that. The reason I do that is because I want the person to feel safe to say no if they want to, because I'm basically about to ask them to do emotional work for me. And I don't want to do that to someone who feels like they can't say no. So then if they say yes, I see if they'd be willing to help me work through my feedback. And that might mean me sharing all of my ugly, terrible feelings about the feedback, and them helping me either validate those or realize that like maybe that's a knee-jerk reaction, and then determine what I should do from here, right? And then finally, make a plan. So now we're done reacting to the feedback. We've slept on it, we've researched it, we've processed it, maybe we've got some help processing it. Processing is done, it's time to figure out what we're going to do about the feedback. So this is the place where we're making action steps to figure out how we're going to go about affecting change in response to the feedback. And once again, having a plan like this can give you some steps to follow that can reduce the anxiety of responding in a productive way to feedback. Okay. So what have we talked about? Well, we talked about the adversarial model for feedback and where it comes from. We talked about a more cooperative model for feedback. We talked about how to ensure our own safety before giving feedback, as well as how to give useful feedback. We also talked about how to attract feedback, how to respond to feedback, and how to turn the feedback that we need to change something into an actionable plan. So that's all I have for you. I'm happy to take questions if we do questions of these things. Do we still do questions of these things? Okay, sweet. Does the slide say questions? It does. Y'all, we stayed on slides the whole time. That was harder than it looked, I think. Does anyone have any questions for me? I do. Sure.
What about giving feedback if someone doesn't ask for it or doesn't want it? Maybe that conversation has to happen?
So the question was, what about giving feedback when the person doesn't ask for feedback or doesn't want it, and the conversation has to happen? In those cases, am I a person with the power to fire this person?
Yeah.
If I am, then I can give it directly, because it's giving unwelcome feedback is safest if you're doing it down a power gradient. So maybe you have more institutional power. Now it's worth mentioning that there are a couple of different power gradients, right? There's sort of an institutional power gradient like that. There's an experience power gradient. There's also a gender power gradient. There's a race power gradient. There's a sexuality power gradient. There's a social capital power gradient. So those things are all worth keeping in mind, but essentially, the steeper downward the power gradient is, the safer it is to give unwelcome feedback. If I'm not the person who can do it, I'll generally find the person who is. If the conversation really has to happen, I'm looking for that person's manager or that person's like 2 levels up if that's what's necessary. And I'll talk to that person about it, and that way I'm not endangering myself directly, but I'm providing the information that the person needs in order to make the change. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
How would you approach the question, I often get asked, like, do you have any feedback for me? Like, how do you go about, would you just ask them about their goals, like in response?
Yeah, so the question was how to respond when someone says, do you have any feedback for me? In that situation, I think you're right. I think what I would do is I would ask what their goals are. I would ask them to think about, I give them a number, I'll ask them to think about 2 or 3 goals that they either have personally or they feel like are going to be really important to their career. And if I'm their manager, if they value my opinion in some way, then I'll like consider if I need to helping them adjust their goals. So maybe they have 3 things that they think are important, and I'll say, well, you know, number 3 maybe is not necessarily as important as you think it is, but this other thing might be useful to them. I'll think pretty hard about making that judgment call. Usually I let people decide on their own what they want to get better at, and I just help them figure out how to get better at the things that they want to get better at. But that's an option that you have if you feel like that's useful. But in general, yeah, I'll ask them for their goals.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or opinions on regularity of feedback?
Yeah. So the question was, do I have any opinions on the regularity of feedback? I think it does depend on the person a little bit, because suppose somebody's received a piece of feedback that takes a really long time to process and do something with, and you really have to, they have to change like a thought pattern that they've had for a really long time. In those cases, it could potentially make sense to give that person some time and work on it, and maybe help with checkpoints if that's something that they're looking for. So that would be an example. That would be an example for like a longer feedback cycle. In general, I'm a big fan, if I'm talking about shorter feedback cycles, so we're talking about a technical skill or something where it's a skill that's related to my job and is something that I want to be constantly getting better at and rapidly getting better at, I'm looking for as much feedback as I can receive as quickly as I can receive it, essentially. When it comes to technical feedback, I prefer a fire hose. That's probably not everyone. So I think it might depend on the individual to some degree, but it's still worth considering a gradient wherein feedback that's like easier to fix can probably be given more frequently, and feedback about something that's really going to take some work, maybe think about doing it less often. Does that answer the question?
What do you do if you can't really get negative feedback from somebody, if they like only give you positive feedback but you want negative feedback?
Gotcha. So the question was, what do you do if you can't, if a person is only giving you positive feedback and they're not really giving you anything where you can change something? In those situations, I generally won't put too much pressure on someone, but there's one thing that I might try if I don't think it's going to make them anxious. And that is that I'll share, let's say it's on a piece of code, right? Let's say that I've written this method and I want their feedback on it. They never give me anything negative. And you can apply this as well to interpersonal situations or something that's not code. I could say, look, here's an example of some work that I've done. I'm happy with A, B, and C, but I really feel like there's something missing here with regard to the legibility of the code. I don't feel like a new developer would quickly be able to understand the intent and the context of this method. Do you have any suggestions for how I might be able to fix something like that? And that way, you've sort of taken a lot of the steps for them. You've shown them your goal. You've shown them the piece that you are thinking critically about, that you want their help thinking critically about. And sometimes folks won't necessarily frame that in their mind as giving you negative feedback so much anymore as helping you with a challenge that you're struggling with. So it can be helpful to reframe it in that way. It also, I'll be careful about doing that because there are certain topics around which it might be possible to make the person feel like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place where they have to agree with your assessment and say you're bad at something, or disagree with your assessment and say you're good at it, but in the process, like, question your judgment of the thing, kind of. I'm struggling to think of a good example right now, but things in the interpersonal realm would possibly be closer to this, you know. Was I too, you know, did I come down too hard on so-and-so? Actually, that's a good example. Did I come down too hard on so-and-so? Well, yeah. You know, it can be hard. If somebody's really conflict averse, it can be hard to get them to say that. But then the alternative to that is like, no, that person totally had it coming, which also would produce anxiety for a conflict averse person. So a little bit context dependent there, but in general, I'll find that sharing a challenge I'm having with someone and asking them to help me work through it will frame it in a way that might start to tease out some of their thoughts that they might think I would respond poorly to. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
I really like your model of two people sitting across the table from each other and trying to move that from kind of opposing positions to a collaborative position. Mm-hmm. I kind of think, I sort of imagine as you were distilling that for yourself, you ran into a couple like pitfalls as you were trying to get to a collaborative position. Do you have examples of pitfalls that somebody might run into as they're trying to kind of take that model and implement it a little more?
Totally. So the question is about whether there are pitfalls associated with attempting to adopt this kind of collaborative model of feedback giving rather than adversarial one. And I think there totally are. I think that sometimes it can be a little bit tough to get people to state their goals. Sometimes people aren't even necessarily sure what their goals are, and that can produce some anxiety for them around like, you know, Chelsea asked me for my goals and I haven't provided any goals, and now I'm like nervous to go talk to her more about it because I'm afraid she's annoyed that I didn't provide the goals in like a timely fashion and that kind of thing. So, which you wouldn't necessarily foresee that potentially being an issue, but I've seen that a couple of times. So in those cases, I will try to emphasize, like, I'm asking you to provide this information so that I can give you feedback that's helpful to you. And in, I would say, 95% of cases, folks will either do it or they like won't press me for feedback as long as they have not provided these goals. So that's one thing that you could potentially run into. Another one is what we were talking about before, wherein with a particularly conflict-averse person, if you really, really need feedback from them, you could end up in a situation where you're kind of putting them between a rock and a hard place. That could be a little bit difficult. A third potential pitfall is that if the power gradient is like steep enough downward, it can be hard to, in those situations, it's possible that any feedback you give that somebody might need to change something could be perceived as like a threat to their job or to their current standing or that kind of thing. And in those situations, it's particularly important to focus on the idea that they have this goal and you are on their side helping them achieve that goal. I've literally used the phrase, "I am on your side," in the past to help with that. And I would say 60% of the time it helps. Does that answer the question?
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for making feedback a pattern on distributed teams? Like if you're never up to face-to-face with someone but you work with them a lot, how do you make that comfortable still?
Totally. So the question was, do I have any advice on giving feedback or making feedback a pattern in distributed teams? Is that right? Yep. So distributed team is an interesting scenario because you might be in different locations. I think more disruptive than being in different locations for like a software development team is if you're in different time zones and then you're working asynchronously. I find that asynchronous working, in my experience, produces more hurdles than just working in different places at the same time. That having been said, I think it's a conversation that can still occur. It doesn't necessarily have to be a phone call or something synchronous like that. Conveniently, the topic of like, well, what are your goals? You know, I'd like to be able to help you achieve your goals. Usually when you ask somebody that, they don't have an answer right then anyway. And so it's a conversation that lends itself particularly well to an asynchronous style of communication. And so in my experience, doing something like this makes feedback a little easier to deliver in an asynchronous context because, first of all, part of the conversation is asynchronous anyway. And second of all, when you change the framing of feedback from the adversarial to this sort of conspiratorial model, there's less concern about, like, well, will the tone of what I'm writing come through as helpful? Because the basis of helpfulness has already been established and you're no longer having to tiptoe around this adversarial idea about what feedback is. And you're both on the same team trying to get the same thing done. So that's my thoughts on that. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks.
At all?
When you're talking about asynchronous communication versus face-to-face, are you worried about sort of misperceptions of tone and that sort of thing, knowing that like writing can sometimes be very flat, perceived as more negative than maybe intended?
Yeah, so tone in writing is something that I think about a lot. I've worked on a number of distributed teams, and I am also a woman, and so I have to, in certain circumstances, judiciously use like smiley emojis and exclamation points and that kind of thing. If that's a completely foreign concept to you, I recommend you Google it. You will be absolutely floored by what you will find on this topic of tone in writing, particularly for women. Women and non-white people as well. So, yeah, I worry about it a lot. I have found that changing the conversation to a more collaborative one helps to remove some of that fear for me, but the fear certainly remains. that answer the question?
That was very much.
That all? Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely, what is it, Wednesday? A lovely Wednesday.